It's a great pleasure to introduce Naomi Segal. She is undoubtedly one of the best colleagues I've had at Birkbeck, of quite a few. She was at Birkbeck until a short while ago. She's greatly esteemed, I think, by all of us. She was foundational to the IMLR, so it's very fitting that we begin our association with you, Joe, with Naomi speaking to us, and I'm very excited about listening to her today. James and I had the privilege of working with her on a book on replacement that she edited a couple of years back, and she continues to work on replacement today. So the reading of guilt in Freud is a byproduct of work on replacement, as I understand it. So without more ado, I'm going to hand you over to Naomi.
Thanks very much, and thanks to James for doing the share screen. Just keep rolling when I've said my quotations. Okay, in one of his last publications, the new introductory lecture, number 32, Anxiety and Instinctual Life, that's in 1932, Freud makes this rather surprising declaration. This is quote 1, the problems which the unconscious sense of guilt have opened up, its connections with morality, education, crime and delinquency, are at present the preferred field for psychoanalysts. Now, two things stand out in this. One is the huge range, morality, education, crime, and delinquency, all mainly social rather than individual. And also the second thing is the stress on guilt as something unconscious, which here and elsewhere, he reminds us, is contrary to logical expectation. Back in 1907, Freud had referred to parallels between obsessional neurosis and religious practice. Quote 2, the sufferer from compulsions and prohibitions behaves as if he were dominated by a sense of guilt, of which, however, he knows nothing, so that we must call it an unconscious sense of guilt, in spite of the apparent contradiction in terms. This sense of guilt has its source in early mental events, but it's constantly being revived by renewed temptations, which arise whenever there is a contemporary provocation. Strachey notes, and this is quote 3, that the word used here is Schuldbewusstsein, consciousness of guilt, whereas most of the time Freud's preferred term is Schuldgefühl, feeling of guilt, which Strachey translates as sense, but he uses sense in the translation of either one of these. There's another paradox which Freud highlights this early, which means that you are more likely to feel bad the more good you are. Quote 4, the sense of guilt of obsessional neurotics finds its counterpart in the protestations of pious people that they know at heart they are miserable sinners. And we'll see all the way through that religion has a very major part to play in Freud's thinking on guilt. The later we look in Freud's writing, with the development and the analysis of the superego, the more guilt is associated with conscience, which again draws us into the seeming absurdity of a guilt feeling of which we are not aware and which has no object. For he notes, what is, quote 5 and 6, what is conscience? On the evidence of language, it's related to that of which one is most certainly conscious, because in German it's Gewissen. Indeed, in some languages, and a good example is French, as Strachey puts in a footnote, the words for conscience and consciousness can scarcely be distinguished. I mean, in French, they can't be distinguished. Conscience works for both, which is quite a problem for translators. And then also Freud's concern about the difference between feeling guilty and being guilty, which I shall henceforth call the problem of the real event. The problem of the real event is something that comes up in psychoanalysis a lot, because the status of what actually has happened in the historical world is often given second place to the status of what people feel has happened or fantasize. I'll return to this repeatedly. But so let's start by setting up some first principles. Whodunnit? For those who, like me, think of guilt as something to do with the murder mysteries they love to read and watch, there seems to be a simple trajectory. There is a body in the library, lying in a pool of blood. Somebody must be responsible. Call in the detective or maybe the psychoanalyst, and you will sooner or later find out who. Indeed, the early cases, the early Freud case histories of hysteria, the team of what Lacan called ces femmes merveilleuses, all show vocal evidence of self-blame. These narratives felt like detective fiction, and later on, if I hope I get all the way to the end, we'll see a place where Freud explicitly says that the technique works like detective work. So dreams and phrases that need to be painstakingly undone like clues or red herrings so that symptom becomes secret, id becomes ego, and at last hysterical misery is transformed into common unhappiness, as he ends the book saying. In murder mysteries, as Michel Butor analyzes brilliantly in L'Emploi du Temps, an initiating event, the finding of the body, leads both forward and backwards through time to an originating event, the intention followed by the act. And as Northrop Frye argues in Anatomy of Criticism, these are both texts from the 1950s, the exposure of the criminal leads to the social casting out of a scapegoat and the happy restoration of the status quo. But this is not what Freud is interested in. And yet he is repeatedly haunted by it, as we shall see. Another literary representation of the problems of whodunit can be found in Camus' L'Étranger, which was published in 1942. I used to teach this text in Cambridge, and I used to say to the students, is Meursault innocent? And they'd all say, yes, unhesitatingly. And I would say, okay, get out a gun, shoot me dead, and ring my husband and say, I've killed your wife. Not, I'm sorry, I've killed your wife, because of course that doesn't happen. Though if you read carefully, you'll see Meursault is always trying to apologize and stopping himself. Anyway, but they'd ring my husband, say, I've killed your wife, but the sun was in my eyes. Meursault is, of course, not innocent. He's definitely shot dead the nameless Arab, and he's sealed the act with a few extra shots. Not only that, but the text is full of imagery of universal guilt, metaphors from Oedipus, Sodom and Gomorrah, and so on. And Meursault's own obsessive thoughts, this is quote 9, de toute façon, on est toujours un peu fautif. Everybody's always a bit guilty, especially in relation to his mother. But everything in the rhetoric of the book is designed to make you judge this murderer innocent. What does that mean? Famously, it appears to be, people who admire Camus will say, very bold and very radical, but actually it flattens out the question. If even Meursault is innocent, then everyone is innocent and everyone is guilty. Freud himself doesn't make much use of the term innocent. In a moment, I'll give you a few examples, but I'm going to take the liberty of quoting a phrase I've used myself. It is I haven't numbered it. I'm just going to tell you it, which is the phrase I use to try and explain why his work is of such interest to literary studies. The principle of psychoanalysis as a mode of interpretation, I believe, is that everything is an utterance and no utterance is innocent. By this, I mean that meaning can be extracted from any word, gesture, or action, and the speaker, actor, or gesturer, think of Dora and her reticule, is never in control of that meaning, or who will discover or exploit it. The wiliness of the analyst or critic or detective will inevitably confound your will to secrecy, though no doubt you will find ever new things to try and be secret about. Occasionally, Freud talks about actual people, historical or fictional, who are accused of crimes they have not committed as being innocent. But mainly he uses this term for the much put upon ego, which is preyed upon by three adversaries, the naughty id, the bumps and scrapes of external life, and the implacable superego. The superego is the root of the whole problem of the sense of guilt, although it's never completely clear if it's the cause or the effect. But if we want to know how the ego is innocent, we'll have to admit that this has something to do with ignorance. Here is a ringing declaration from the rough midpoint of his career, In the Ego and the Id, 1923, followed by a telling footnote. Now, I've changed the translation, not least because Strachey has, as he always, very often does, translated Mensch misleadingly as man, which of course gives completely strange impression. So I'll just read the English, I think, but the German is there for you in quote 11. If anyone were inclined to put forward the paradoxical proposition that the normal person is not only much more immoral than they believe, but also much more moral than they know, psychoanalysis, on whose findings the first half of the assertion rests, would raise no objection against the second half either. And the footnote says, this proposition is only apparently a paradox. It simply states that one's nature extends much further, both in goodness and in badness, than one thinks, i.e. than one's ego is aware of through conscious perception. Again, this is the pushing it towards the unconscious. For the rest of this presentation, I'll attempt to keep broadly to chronology because I want to show the kind of developments and indeed repetitions that occur through time. As I said in the blurb, This research grew out of the notes accumulated over 7 years in a seminar group at Birkbeck, which read its way through the 23 volumes of the standard edition of Freud, translation edited by James Strachey and his team. My main aim was to trace the development of Freud's thought in relation to replacement, which is what I'm working on. But I built up notes on other aspects. And when I did the notes for this paper, which run to about 50 pages, I did both my own references that I'd listed at the front of the book, but I also used Strachey's index. And it's quite interesting to see that he'd begin with a reference to guilt, sense of, but then he would cross-reference with things like self-reproach, self-punishment, remorse, conscience, and of course, superego. There is something odd that I will just mention for the Germanists among you, which he says in a footnote that self-reproach is his translation of Vorwurf, which means reproach or accusation, rather than Selbstvorwurf, which occasionally appears in Freud, but which appears less often in Vorwurf. I'm not quite sure why Strachey does this, because he doesn't explain. Okay, now throughout my discussion, I'll be keeping my eyes open for a particular set of issues. The first one is the real event, which I talked about earlier. And then there is questions of gender, in which at first guilty acts belong to naughty little girls and eventually belong to what the wonderful Leslie Fiedler would have called good bad boys, ultimately Jesus, progressing also from one kind of invisibility to another and from a stress on fathers to a stress on parents. That's my gender stuff. Then I'm also picking up the unconscious and conscious question and individual and society question. And finally, what I have been calling the 3 M's, which occur quite often in relation to this guilt issue, and they are masturbation, masochism, and melancholia. That covers everything really, doesn't it? And at the end, I'm going to revisit the rare places where Freud explicitly discusses crime and delinquency in relation to the sense of guilt. So here's where the story begins. In the first volume, Pre-Psychoanalytic Publications, in the letter to Fliess of 1895, Freud refers to, this is quote 12, a pure sense of guilt without any content, appearing after puberty in relation to a childhood sexual experience that caused only pleasure at the time. It sets off an obsessional neurosis, which may be expressed as consciousness, self-reproach, etc., etc. Those are that little cluster of words. Typical of such sufferers is a hysterical girl who identifies with a servant girl seduced by her brother or father. Freud comments, there is tragic justice in the fact that the action of the head of the family in stooping to a servant girl is atoned for by his daughter's self-abasement. Such girls and young women, of course, appear frequently in the early volumes, studies on hysteria and other case histories of young women. They're little Lady Macbeths, washing their hands of the crime of masturbation. And if you want, we can come back to a discussion about this, that why masturbation is so important at this time as a wrong act. Because, of course, we don't think of it as a wrong act anymore, but the ways in which it functioned as a wrong act at the time were quite telling. It was to do with restraining yourself and holding back and learning to stop yourself and all those things. But these little girls, interestingly, do actually have real acts. So there really are acts that Freud describes in these early volumes, acts of theft or unkindness, so that their obsessive remorse does have an immediate cause as well as a more remote one, the replaced idea. An interesting instance of the real event are the little girls in Two Lies Told by Children. This is 2013, in which spending 50 Pfennig on paints or cheating at school by drawing a supposedly freehand circle with a compass relate to early erotic emotions towards the father. These little girls don't turn into criminals, but their feminine futures are colored by the guilt together with its punishment. And finally, of course, there's a little girl in A Child is Being Beaten, probably based on Freud's analysis of his daughter Anna. And she also manifests the guilt feelings consequent on an excessive love for the father and masturbation, stroke, masochism. These two things occur together in that sort of case history. In quote 17, he says, masochism becomes not only the punishment for the forbidden genital relation, but also the regressive substitute for that relation. So this kind of masochism is later called feminine masochism, but it slides into moral masochism, which of course is the subject for the superego. Before I turn to Freud's later arguments on the unconscious sense of guilt, which in the guise of the superego, translated into a collective form, brings about the great social changes that lead to Judaism and Christianity, I want to pause for a moment on the question of gender. Now, there are two places where Freud cites a crucial turning point that he calls the advance in intellectuality. This is a slightly awkward translation for der Fortschritt in der Geistigkeit, because geistig can mean a lot of things other than intellectual. But I think it's a good translation because it works for this context. However it's rendered, it refers to a change of value assigned to ways of knowing and seeing. The last appearance of this idea was in a posthumous separate edition in 1939 of parts of Moses and monotheism, I think. And the first, I'm going to talk about the first now, which is a footnote to the case of the Ratner. Here Freud cites Lichtenberg as saying, this is quote 19, an astronomer knows whether the moon is inhabited or not with about as much certainty as he knows who his father was, but not with so much certainty as he knows who his mother was. And he adds, a great advance was made in civilization when, well, not men really, but people decided to put their inferences upon a level with the testimony of their senses. Decided to put their inferences upon a level with the testimony of their senses, and to make the step from matriarchy, Mutterrecht, to patriarchy, Vaterrecht. In Moses and monotheism, he connects it to the compulsion of the Hebrews to worship a God whom one cannot see, and says, for it meant that a sensory perception was given second place to what may be called an abstract idea, a triumph of intellectuality over sensuality, or strictly speaking, an instinctual renunciation with all its necessary psychological consequences, these being guilt, etc. I'm quoting one more example of this. So this is from Moses' monotheism, quote 21. It came about that the matriarchal social order was succeeded by the patriarchal one. This turning from the mother to the father points in addition to a victory of intellectuality over sensuality. That is, an advance in civilization, since maternity is proved by the evidence of the senses, while paternity is the hypothesis based on an inference and a premise. Taking sides in this way, with a thought process in preference to a sense perception, has proved to be a momentous step. Actually, there's more to it because there are examples of people being of unknown mother, but I'll have to come back to it later if you want me to. Now, I discovered this thing about 1985 when I was researching on Manon Lescaut, and this is what I wrote, and I still think it. It's in green because it's not by Freud. Just such a momentous step, it seems, gave rise to the new science of psychoanalysis. But it's a step that the science elsewhere quite happily retraced, though not in favour of any Mutterrecht. We cannot forget that this is a theory which founds the whole of its developmental psychology on a moment of seeing, that instant when the child, supposedly both male and female, it's unlikely, discovers the female genital, or rather the lack of male genital visible on the female body. All the perplexities and perversity of Freud's female Oedipus complex are the result of his failure to make the intellectual advance from a théorie de voyeur, that's Hélène Cixous, based on a little boy's reasoning, and which continues doggedly to assume that a genital you can see with your eyes is in every way better than one you cannot. And I think we need to keep this in mind when we look at the later text, the big text where he does most of his discussion of the sense of guilt and superego. Because at the back of everything, he keeps the Oedipus complex, which is based on that moment of saying, I can't see any penis on the girl's, on the woman's body. And so I think it's still there haunting the problem. Right, now I'm going to go on to these four main texts then. Totem and Taboo of 1913, The Ego and the Id of 1923, Civilization and Discontent, 1930, and Moses and Monotheism, 1937 and 39. Begin with Totem and Taboo. So Freud starts here from my third M, melancholia, the pathological form of mourning. Ambivalence towards the dead produces obsessive self-reproaches, this is quote 23, with hostility against the dead disguised as self-defense. In one of his always important and interesting footnotes, he writes, the sense of guilt, this is 25, I think, the sense of guilt in the case of taboos is not in the least diminished if the violation occurs unwittingly. This is not the same as unconsciously. The unwittingly thing is a different issue, I think. An interesting parallel is found in Greek mythology. The guilt of Oedipus was not palliated by the fact that he incurred it without his knowledge and even against his intention. Now, I've always taught and learned, or thought anyway, that the difference between classical tragedy and modern-ish tragedy, neoclassical tragedy, say like Shakespeare, is that in Shakespeare it is a tragedy of character, and in the Greek mythology it's a tragedy of fate in the more traditional way. In other words, Oedipus will commit a crime without intending it, and even trying very hard not to commit that crime as he knows it's been predicted. But the question then arises, what does this unwitting, I'm sure we can come back to this, does this make Oedipus innocent? A few pages later, Freud brings this together with the question of the conscious or unconscious status of the sense of guilt. He shows us that hysterics often refer by their symptoms to experiences that have only occurred in their imagination. Remember, of course, the momentous abandonment of the seduction theory in about 1897. And this is quote now 26. They attribute the neurotic sense of guilt to real misdeeds would show an equal misunderstanding. An obsessional neurotic may be weighed down by a sense of guilt that would be appropriate in a mass murderer, while in fact from his childhood onwards he has behaved to his fellow men as the most considerate and scrupulous member of society. Nevertheless, now this is where Freud is we've got a battle with him a bit. Nevertheless, he says, his sense of guilt has a justification. It's founded on the intense and frequent death wishes against his fellows, which are unconsciously at work in him. It has a justification if what we take into account are unconscious thoughts and not intentional deeds. And that's, of course, what's happening with Oedipus. If he did it, he must have been going to do it. If he was going to do it, he must have intended it in some way. So, do we wish to kill our father and marry our mother? Or have we killed the king in order to take his place? Familiarly, it doesn't matter. To Freud, that is. The deed need not have happened, yet the guilt feeling is justified. And he says the same thing, and it's done in a more kind of sort of engaging way when he's talking to the Rat Man. This is 1909, quite a lot earlier. He says, when there's a mésalliance between an affect and its ideational content, in this instance between the intensity of the self-reproach and the occasion for it, a layman will say that the affect is too great for the occasion. It's exaggerated, and that consequently the inference following from the self-reproach, the inference that the patient is a criminal, is false. On the contrary, the physician says, no, the affect is justified. The sense of guilt is not in itself open to further criticism, but it belongs to some other content, which is unknown, unconscious, it's his italic, and which requires to be looked for. Returning to totem and taboo, both what he calls primitive peoples and neurotics have excessive levels of ambivalence. And again, this is focused on the powerful father who simultaneously hated and loved, especially after he's died. The killing of the father, the quote 28, great event with which civilization began and which since it occurred has not allowed mankind a moment's rest, in other words, guilt, need never have happened. We find no deeds, but only impulses and emotions, set upon evil deeds, but held back from their achievement. So in other words, what's interesting in a way is that he's not giving any kind of credit. There is no interest in giving credit for holding back from acts of whatever, transgression of various kinds. So holding back is not really counted in your favor. And as we've seen, this is connected both to the unconscious conscience and to the act carried out unwittingly by the classical heroes. Freud has more to say later on the father religion, Judaism, and the son religion of Christianity, but here he begins the drama in the shape of the guilt of the hero of tragedy. And I think it's very interesting how he links together the hero of tragedy, who was archetypally for him Oedipus, but there are many others, to the Jesus story. So in the light of our everyday life, this is quote 30, it's often no guilt at all. The crime which was thrown onto his shoulders, presumptuousness and rebelliousness against a great authority, was precisely the crime for which the members of the chorus, the company of brothers, were responsible. Thus the tragic hero became, though it might be against his will, the redeemer of the chorus. And the term redeemer, of course, will go on being important. a last point, which again will reappear in later volumes. All this is heavily biased towards a masculine world. Yes, scary fathers, hated but also loved by their frustrated sons who resent being denied access to the women that the old man hogs to himself. A far cry from the reverse ambivalence of the troubled daughters that we met at the beginning of Freud's writing. All very Harold Bloom and male Oedipal. And yet repeatedly, Freud changes his mind about the masculinity of a society built on patriarchy. Now, we've seen the matriarchy-patriarchy being very masculine, but a bit flawed, more than a bit flawed. But here is his change of mind. This appears in another footnote, which pops up unexplained as he's getting into questions of the individual versus the collective mind. Was the crucial emotional ambivalence acquired by this is 31, acquired by the human race in connection with their father complex? Or was it, as he suddenly puts in, more correctly, and more correctly is a slightly mistranslation, but anyway, you'll see, more correctly, their parental complex. So what it says in the German is Vater complex in the text, and respektive Eltern complex in the footnote. What exactly is happening here? It's a sudden complexity of gender that's never accounted for. Is he allowing women some familial authority? This does occur sometimes, but rarely. Or is he pulling back from the extremity of the battle between fathers and children, letting in a breath of the positivity that the ambivalence promises, but the guilt seems to forbid? So I'm just leaving this on the question, but I'll give you a few small examples quickly of the same sort of thing. Remember little Hans crying out, "Oh, Daddy, you are lovely." I remember that was such a nice moment. Or the wolf man wanting his father to punish him and finding the latter instead trying to, quote 35, I think, pacify him by playing ball in front of him with the pillows of his cot. In both these cases, like that of the rat man, Freud is trying to emphasize the little boy's desire to be punished by his father. I mean, little girl too, because we see that in the child is being beaten thing, which he may preempt by being unaccountably naughty, a miniature criminal from a sense of guilt, which is a category I will come back to. Yet often the dynamic is refused. Father is gentle, or discipline comes from both parents together, and it's not a kind of child-father drama. And I've given you a little list in quote 36, which isn't really a quote, of other references if you're interested in this substitution of parents for father. Linked to the failure of the father to be properly severe. Much of the ambivalence may be rooted in Freud's own motivation as both a father and a son, of course, but I mean, being biographical is never very useful. At the same time, he does cling to the Oedipus complex in its original form as endemic to the sense of guilt, and we've already seen that, and we'll see it again. And the word, and I've got a quotation here in both languages, I think I'll probably just read it in English, but notice the word right at the end, in English soluble, and in German eine Auflösung, which is about solving a mystery. And seems to be slightly surprising, but actually is very apt here. So, that the beginnings of religion, morals, society, and art converge in the Oedipus complex. This is in complete agreement with the psychoanalytic finding that the same complex constitutes the nucleus of all neuroses so far as our present knowledge goes. It seems to me a most surprising discovery that the problems of social psychology, too, should prove soluble on the basis of one single concrete point, man's relation to his father. And it is actually not, it's immediately after this that he changes from Vater complex to Eltern complex. And also, Strachey is making a much more masculine drama, man's relationship to his father, than the German warrants, given that in the German there's no man, there's not even Mensch. There's only das Verhältnis, the relationship, which allows for offspring of either sex. And then the father turns into the parents. So whose body is it in the library after all? Okay, the ego and the id. There's much in the ego and the id about the superego, though it didn't get to feature in the title, which is quite intriguing, not in either language, obviously. Like the id, the superego is an unconscious element within the ego. Thus, quote 39, not only what is lowest, but what is highest in the ego can be unconscious. Now, there are some conditions, he says, like obsessional neurosis and melancholia, where the opposite is true. The ego is what he calls over noisy. The German is überlaut. But in hysteria and more generally, A great part of the sense of guilt must normally remain unconscious because the origin of conscience is intimately connected with the Oedipus complex, which belongs to the unconscious. So again, we have this same solution. Here, Freud offers his diagnosis of the immorality and morality in the human psyche that we saw earlier. And he adds an example that he's developed in an earlier volume and which I'll return to. People who carry out criminal acts, but do so, as it were, retroactively, and which we've had a hint of before. He says, 42, it was a surprise to find that an increase in this unconscious sense of guilt can turn people into criminals. But it's undoubtedly a fact. In many criminals, especially youthful ones, it is possible to detect the very powerful sense of guilt which existed before the crime, and is therefore not its result, but its motive. And if Victoria is there somewhere, we were talking about it by email, Gide, when he writes about courts of law, says something rather similar, that there are these frightened children who then get so frightened that they slaughter their entire family. And that's the same sort of idea, that there's something going on which is preceding and precipitating the crime. And then he says, Freud says, it's as if it was a relief to be able, as it was in Gide's argument, to be able to fasten this unconscious sense of guilt onto something real and immediate. The main emphasis in the rest of the text is on the severity of the superego. I'll jump a little bit. The sadism of the superego and the masochism of the ego. He calls the ego a poor creature, and he earlier called it innocent. Okay, jumping now to Civilization, Its Discontents, which is published 7 years later in 1930. Freud distinguishes between human and animal societies by showing that civilized humans have introjected their tendency to aggression in the form of the superego. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us the sense of guilt, and it expresses itself in a need for punishment. And again, it's immaterial whether a person's actually done anything wrong. Quote 47, if we ask how a person comes to have a sense of guilt, we arrive at an answer which cannot be disputed. A person feels guilty, devout people would say sinful, when they've done something which they know to be bad. But then we notice how little this answer tells us. Perhaps after some hesitation, we shall add that even when a person has not actually done the bad thing, but is only recognized in themselves an intention to do it, they may regard themselves as guilty. And the question then arises of why the intention is regarded as equal to the deed. And again, keep in the back of your mind that resisting the wish to do the bad thing is not given as a credit anywhere. Now he talks about the way that the motivation, the sort of, oh God, I better speed up, I think. I might, yeah. He talks about that in a child, there's a fear of loss of love. And so really you're doing the right thing only because you're frightened that your parents will catch you out. And then gradually the place of the father or the two parents, notice that in 49, is taken by the larger human community, and then you get your conscience or your sense of guilt. And as time goes on, fate, people, saints who call themselves sinners, do so because we have entered the field of ethics where fate is regarded as a substitute for the parental agency. And he says one of his wonderful declarations on the Jews, this is 54, the people of Israel had believed themselves to be the favorite child of God. And when the great father caused misfortune after misfortune to rain down upon this people of his, this is 1930, they were never shaken in their belief in his relationship to them or questioned his power or righteousness. Instead, they produced the prophets who held up their sinfulness before them, and out of their sense of guilt, they created the over-strict commandments of their priestly religion. Yeah, I won't, yes, okay, I won't read out number 55, but you'll see it's the same thing. It's the reader or the hearer, or you and me, wanting to say, but surely it must make a difference if they actually do the bad thing or they don't. And he says, psychoanalysis has nothing to say with that. He gives a bit of an answer, but he doesn't allow it to take us anywhere, which is to use the term remorse or Reue, which he uses for the sense of guilt after having committed a misdeed, weil man etwas verbrochen hat. Again, insisting this is only possible if one already has a conscience. So he then says, remorse of this sort can therefore never help us to discover the origin of conscience and of the sense of guilt in general. Psychoanalysis is thus justified in excluding from the present discussion the case of a sense of guilt due to remorse, i.e. having done something, however frequently such cases may occur. He closes his disturbing discussion by returning to the scene of the killing of the primal father, which supposedly originated the social relation and set up the superego. And from here on in, when he's talking about the development of these great ancient religions, he insists on this idea that there was the primal killing of the father, or the killing of the primal father, but it's an event which there's no way of proving whether such an event ever happened. Nevertheless, dealing with that event, which has or has not happened, is really crucial in everything else from now on. Now, he begins by saying that it all starts with ambivalence. So, quote 60, I think we can at last grasp two things perfectly clearly: the part played by love in the origin of conscience, and the fatal inevitability of the sense of guilt. Whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not really the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case, for the sense of guilt is an expression of the conflict due to ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and the instinct of destruction or death, which is where he's going. And I'm not going to be talking about the death instinct because it's far too problematic. But he says, this conflict is set going as soon as men, but it's not men, it's people, humans, are faced with the task of living together. The conflict and resulting sense of guilt that are felt in the context of the family as the Oedipus complex are then extended in the social context in forms which are dependent on the past. And there's something here about the, again, rather problematic question, which I won't go into, about whether you can inherit, the conscience or the knowledge of the past. Now I'm going to come to the last big text, Moses and monotheism, before I go on to these other little examples of his writings on actual crime. Okay, most of the last text, Moses and Monotheism, was first written in 1934, and it finally came out after he came to England. It's taken up with the reading of the biblical Moses. I love it, but most people think it's more crazy than brilliant, but it's pretty amazing. The key moments are the analysis of the Hebrews' attitude to God from the viewpoint of sense of guilt, the analysis of the Hebrews' attitude to God and suffering, and the crisis of supersession, which is something I'm going to do in my book on replacement, when Saul of Tarsus, alias Paul, created the new culture that was to replace all but a remnant of its founder's religion. So what we're doing is moving from ambivalence to redemption. And it's quite interesting to know that Freud held back publication. Somebody's saying things, but we'll come to that later. Freud held back publication not because he thought the Jews might be a little pissed off, though of course they were, but because the Catholic Church was so powerful in Austria that until he'd actually left, he didn't want to offend them. As we've already seen, the Hebrews amplify their sense of guilt in order to justify holding on to their generally unkind God. And this is where I quote Chaim Baumann, and I can't remember exactly where he said it, but it's just, I love this quote. Not all Jews believe in God, but most like to think that God believes in them. Now, this is what Freud says. It may not have been easy for the people to reconcile a belief in being preferred by their omnipotent God with the sad experiences of their unfortunate destiny. But they didn't allow themselves to be shaken in their convictions. They increased their own sense of guilt in order to stifle their doubts of God. And then along came Saul of Tarsus, and he seized upon, he says, quote 64, seized upon this sense of guilt and traced it back correctly, Freud says, to its original source. He calls this the original sin. It was a crime against God and could only be atoned for by death. A son of God, and of course this is a concept that doesn't exist in Judaism, and it's very pagan and is brought up in Christianity. A son of God had allowed himself to be killed without guilt and had thus taken on himself the guilt of all men, people. It had to be a son, says Freud, since it had been the murder of a father. It's probable that traditions from Oriental and Greek mysteries had had an influence on the fantasy of redemption. But he goes on to say what a paradox it is. How could someone guiltless of the act of murder take upon himself the guilt of the murderers by allowing himself to be killed? It's fantastically complicated and terribly effective, clearly. And he then concludes, I'll just summarize briefly what he says in 67. The Redeemer could be none other than the most guilty person, the ringleader of the company of brothers, who we earlier met as the chorus. Maybe there wasn't a ringleader, he says, maybe there wasn't even an event. If there wasn't a ringleader, then Christ is heir to a wishful fantasy, which remained unfulfilled. If there was one, he was his successor. He was the ringleader's successor. And so Christianity replaces Judaism. The old God the Father fell back behind Christ. Christ the Son took his place, just as every son, he says, wants to replace the Father. I won't quote, will I quote? Yes, I will quote number 70, because it's rather interestingly put about the way that guilt is entered into by Jews and then is amplified by Christians accusing Jews. So the poor Jewish people who, with their habitual stubbornness, continued to disavow the father's murder, atoned heavily for it in the course of time. They were constantly met with the reproach, "You killed our God." And this reproach is true if it is correctly translated. If it is brought into relation with the history of religions, it runs, "You will not admit that you murdered God," primal picture of God, primal father, blah, blah. There should be an addition, he says, declaring, "We did the same thing, to be sure, but we have admitted it, and since then we have been absolved." And that's the redemption argument. And then just briefly to say the last word of Freud's last word, Moses' monotheism, is to call the survival of the Jews a rätsel, a mystery, a riddle. And it's interesting that this is the same word he uses about femininity, the place where knowledge, where psychoanalytic knowledge has to stop. Now, briefly, and I do apologize, I'm being rather rapid, but I just want to come back to 2 or 3 interesting, few but persistent places I've put here where Freud wonders about the real event. Now, these items appear across the full 23 volumes, pretty much, and are framed by 2 contributions to court cases. The first one in 1906, SE9, and the other one in 1930, SE21. They're tiny little things that one might miss, which is why it's quite interesting to do the search for the sense of guilt as I did. In a lecture of 1906, Freud was asked to give his opinion of the method of trying to get an accused person to incriminate themselves by the use of stimulus response tests, which were being developed at the time by the School of Bleuler and Jung in Switzerland. What if this method were used to reveal an incriminating complex? It's a rather daft argument, but it takes him to an interesting argument. So by, quote, 74, leading the accused into an objective self-betrayal. He draws a comparison between police procedure and psychoanalysis, and thus between the criminal and the hysteric. He says, in both we are concerned with a secret, with something hidden. But in the case of the criminal, it's a secret which he knows and hides from you. Whereas in the case of the hysteric, it's a secret which they themselves do not know, doesn't know either, which is hidden even from themselves. Luring the audience with a curious turn for psychoanalytic technique, and if I ever wrote a book on this subject, which I won't, I would use this in my title. He calls psychoanalysis a number of detective devices, eine Reihe von Detektivkünsten, the arts of detection. He lays out the procedure of working against resistance. This will include being on the lookout for remarks in which the hidden meaning glimmers through an innocent expression. And the German word here is harmlos, or the patient contradicts themselves and so on. But the other key difference is that the patient has something to gain from working with the analyst. Although actually in lots of places, he says patients don't want to work with, a lot of patients don't at all want to work with the analyst, and gives examples based on the guilt thing. But the criminal can only lose by cooperating with the police. And here he raises the case, which he will develop over the next more than 30 years, of the person who accuses themselves, even though they're innocent. The word here is unschuldig, the usual word for innocent, which is just a negative of guilty, out of a lurking sense of guilt, which seizes upon the accusation made in a particular instance. And he says this is what a child does. Children, it's a slightly peculiar argument. I think children want to be punished. They feel much better after you've punished them. And sometimes they'll deny the thing you're accusing them of while knowing that they've done some other thing. So they know they deserve it anyway. And this is all everywhere. We've seen it already. Now, I'll come back in conclusion to the second and last case of Freud in the law courts. But first, another glance at that category of criminals who are impelled to act out of a pre-existing sense of guilt. And he's got this lovely little place where he talks about different character types. And they're meant to be characters from fiction, I think, but they're also characters from life. And one of these is the criminal from a sense of guilt, der Verbrecher aus Schuldbewusstsein. Is it probable, Freud asked, that this kind of causation plays any considerable part in human crime. The origin of this obscure sense of guilt before the deed is, of course, the Oedipus complex, and in comparison with there's a little bunch of quotes you can see on the screen. The two great criminal intentions of killing the father and having sexual relations with the mother, the crimes committed in order to fix the sense of guilt to something came as a relief to the sufferers. And he says this thing about children being naughty in order to provoke punishment. And I think I've got, if you roll down, some other examples of the sense of guilt expressing itself as a need for punishment, if anybody's interested. We'll never be sure, it seems, who left the body in the library, or if we are sure, we'll never know why they are pale, like Nietzsche's Bleich and Verbrecher, or epileptic, like Dostoevsky. He's got a whole thing on Dostoevsky. But what Freud insists upon once again is the irrelevance of historical facts. We've seen gentle fathers whose children acquire an over-severe superego because under the impression of the love that they receive, they have no other outlet for their aggressiveness but turning it inwards. And this is the way he reads the fact that terribly sweet, kind, gentle, lenient parents produce children with sometimes huge superegos. Okay, my last one very quickly. And I put this in because it's funny, but it is, as well as being funny, it's a sign of Freud never quite letting go of wanting to be kind of sexually a man. You'll see it there. So this was the last case. He was asked to give an opinion on the case of Philipp Halsmann, convicted of parricide in 1930 and later acquitted, but whose innocence Professor Kupka of Vienna University was keen to establish. Freud is asked whether knowledge of the Oedipus complex would help with a legal decision, and he replies politely with a dismissal and a joke. Precisely because it's always present, the Oedipus complex is not suited to provide a decision on the question of guilt. The situation envisaged in a well-known anecdote might easily be brought about. There was a burglary. A man who had a jemmy in his possession was found guilty of the crime. After the verdict had been given and he had been asked if he had anything to say, he begged to be sentenced for adultery at the same time, since he was carrying the tool for that on him as well. Finished.
Okay, thank you, Naomi, for giving us a lot to think about. There are a couple of questions already in the chat. So I want to maybe, Sylvia, do you want to come in and just ask your question directly to Naomi rather than me sort of translating it?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very intriguing discussion as well, and a lot of food for thought as well. But as you were talking, I kept on thinking about the increase in gender-based violence. And to some extent, it started linking and making sense that is it possible that when we're talking about even the Oedipus complex, in terms of the deeds done and the guilt beforehand, that actually becomes part of the actual deed itself, whereby you are satisfying maybe the ego, and they can't even themselves explain in some cases why they did it, but they look apologetic and sorry for what they've done, although in some cases they are not even aware of what they have done, especially those that lead to death too. So I was just linking that with GBV.
I'd love to see your face. You're a little black square with a name. Never mind. Okay, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. No. Yes. It's highly difficult. It's a very good example of how bad this argument can be made to be. I mean, it happens. I have a cousin who did a very big, long European project on femicide before it became yet a talking point afresh, and the whole incel movement, that whole idea that, you know, a man's justified in killing almost any woman if some other woman doesn't want him. I've been interested in this for ages because it appears in a lot of romantic fiction in the forms of femme fatale, who is always to blame for her own murder. So, you know, he's somewhat, he feels guilty beforehand, but actually that's because he's the suffering, you know. The argument is never really that he has done anything to be guilty for, but that she's done something to be guilty for, and therefore she is responsible for his act in killing her. And I think that's very often the way the argument is put. Plus the violent men who keep saying how sorry they are and then do it again. So I think it's much more complicated, but what it certainly does seem to show is that Freud's argument, it doesn't work for anything actually morally complex in the world of crime and violence. It's actually it's unhelpful, I think, in the way the Merceau thing is unhelpful, because if even a murderer is innocent or could be exculpated by the kind of argument that he appears to be making, he's actually not. He's talking about something different. But if he were to be applied to these questions, it seems to me that it's very unhelpful because it just flattens out the whole question. What was the other one? The issue of father figures. And yeah. Anybody else?
Other questions from the people in this virtual room of ours?
Vic Zeidler.
Yeah.
Vic Reed. Yes, Vic.
Over to you. Do you want to turn your mic on?
Hi. Naomi, I thought that was a tour de force.
Yeah.
And there's so much that is in it. So I just wondered a kind of couple of questions that I was left with. One was that how you explain the development in Freud's work, where you say he starts with those girls and then shifts, and what implication of that shift is. That's one question. The second question that I was really taken with is the move from matriarchy to patriarchy, and the way that your quote frames it as a kind of development from realms of feeling, not sure that's right, or sensual, to the notion of intellect, and the way that Freud commits himself to that. And I think that's opens up really deep issues around the realm of feeling or emotion, or what their place is in relationship to the intellect. Anyway, just staying with those two, because I think there's so much in this that's really worth exploring.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the first one was about starting with the bad girls and ending with the good bad boys, the thing with the Jesus people. Well, in some ways, that's the history of psychoanalysis. And he clearly starts off with a case of the hysterics, and hysterics, of course, in long tradition, were always accused of being liars. And so the badness of those, I think it's interesting that those little girls are properly bad. They do naughty things, but it's not put in this grand context that you get later on for the supposedly masculine version, in which they turn into heroes of classical tragedy or founders of new religions. So I don't know. There's also something that echoes with the abandonment of the seduction theory. You know, that argument that originally so many of these young girls seem to be saying that they'd been seduced or otherwise abused by usually their fathers in childhood. But at a certain point, Freud says this can't be true because, you know, it just couldn't be happening quite this often. There have been many people since who've said actually it could be happening quite that often, especially when they turn out. So to the point where he abandons the seduction theory and creates instead the Oedipus complex, then what he's saying is that it's a drama in the head, it's a drama in the mind of the patient, not a drama in the real world. And that's part of this whole movement from the real event to the unconscious. I mean, the thing with the advancing...
It's important that seems really important to the discussion you framed about the significance of real events, because there's implication that you wanted, and we might want real events to count.
Well, they ought to count, because normally guilt, I mean, that's one of the things that's gone round and round in the guilt group. Does the guilt, are we talking about how people feel, or are we talking about what they've actually done? I mean, I always tell the story, and I don't know if it's really true or whether I've just invented it, because I've never found it since, of a patient who went to Jung and said, Jung, you've got to help me. I've got this terrible guilt feeling. It's obsessing me. And I feel so, really, I want some treatment from you. Do something with this. And he then starts talking about his life. And it turns out that he sits on the sofa all day long while his girlfriend does all the cooking and the childcare and goes out to work. So he's objectively guilty, So, but that's actually not taken, that kommt nicht in Frage for this kind of issue that Freud is interested in a way that psychoanalysis is interested in. It's interested in what the feeling does to you rather than the question of whether it connects to bad things that you're doing or have done. Let me just come back to my problem with the advance in intellectuality is it's all very well and it sounds great. And yes, isn't it good if people can take their intellectual activities and their inferences and reasoning with the thing you can't see over the thing you can see. But don't forget, this was my argument. I mean, sorry if it wasn't completely, didn't come through that strongly, but the Oedipus complex is all about these little boys making these completely barking ideas about it's better to have a penis you can wave than not having a penis and not being able to wave it. And that then actually sets up the entire drama because it's still there all the way around down to the end. Okay, I've only, let me just come back to, because James has put something in the chat about emotion. I don't think Freud's talking about emotion at all. I don't think he's associating, when he says the sensual or the instinctual, he's not talking about emotion, because emotion actually belongs rather strongly in the other side, the how you operate, because your unconscious is doing things to you. So that earlier one, the earlier stage where you drew on the inference. And sorry, can I say that I'm rambling a bit, but I just want to come back to the knowing who your mother is. There is a whole tradition of people having been declared, this happened particularly in France, but not only, as being de mère inconnue, of unknown mother. And this was partly a political thing. Rich men whose wife was infertile would get a girl pregnant and then declare that baby as being of unknown mother and take it into their family. And of course, mothers are it's only the second of birth at which the mother is known. 10 minutes later, no, a bit longer, 10 days later, you don't know who the mother is either. And there's I advise you all to go onto YouTube and watch a thing called The Twin Inside Me, which is about some children who were taken away from their mothers because they were declared not to be genetically related to her, even though in fact they clearly were born from her. There was video evidence to prove it. But genetically, there was a piece of evidence that showed that they weren't. And a lot of consequences followed from that. And it would have extraordinary echoes. No, I won't go there because it's too complicated to explain. But have a look at this thing called The Twin Inside Me. You can still get it on the internet. Sorry, should I be looking at the...
No, I can invite people to... Sam's had to leave, so... I
see that, yes.
One thing, there was a question here about the place of history. Karen, are you still there?
Is that further up the chat?
It is, yeah.
Let me roll it back up.
Karen, do you want to ask your question?
Karen, is there an argument against the place of history?
Naomi, does that make sense to you?
Well, just that sentence, is there an argument against the place of history? Yes, obviously. Psychoanalysis is wonderful, and it's all about arguing against the place of history in a way. I mean, is that what you mean? You mean the real event by the history? I don't know. Where is Karen? Is she there? Oh, yes.
Here,
Karen,
yeah.
You seem to be there, but muted. Would you like to explain your question?
She says, yes, the real event.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
Is there an argument against the rights of the real event? Yes, I'm sure there is. I think Freud makes it, and he probably makes it extremely powerfully and richly. I suppose that I wanted to keep holding up the real event because I do think it's hanging behind all sorts of things all the way through. So, for example, if you say it doesn't actually matter if anybody killed, if the primal father, the killing of the primal father took place or didn't take place, you can see that that's true. That seems to be right. But of course, if it actually didn't take place, then in some ways, building up your whole argument on the basis that there was this grand act and then its consequences doesn't hold water anymore. And he's obviously worried because he knows that he feels that the everyday, not entirely stupid reader, us, is going to make that argument. And I suppose it's the same argument, the kind of real event argument is the thing about the seduction theory as well. Because at the moment where he abandoned the seduction theory, it stopped being bad fathers doing things, mostly fathers, doing things to children, and started being children having fantasies about their parents, which is still a question of guilt, actually. And he also started to talk about mothers and nursemaids seducing babies when they wipe their bums, etc. And so actually if something has gone wrong and is clearly now showing its effects, he's exculpating one lot to move the guilt around somewhere. So actually, in some ways, if you're going to apply guilt at all to psychoanalysis, I think the question of the real event is always going to haunt it. Even if I was being a bit flippant when I said whodunit and the body in the library. And yeah, see where we are now.
Thanks, Naomi. There are two more questions, and then I want to let James, do you want to come in and mention your point, which I think is really interesting on the entry of this terminology of guilt into English coming from Freud. I don't know if you want to say something briefly about that.
Who's this? Who is this?
That's James Brown.
You mean
yeah.
now? Well, yes. I mean, I think one of the striking things when I said guilt's become an emotion, I didn't mean necessarily within Freud's scheme of things, but as far as we've been able to make out, the most plausible suspect for a body of work that's influential enough to cause this semantic shift in what guilt signifies in English, at any rate, it looks as if it's Freud's work. We haven't yet been able to pin down anything else that looks as if it could have affected this shift. If you go back to the New English Dictionary, the OED as it was, its first edition, the closest it gets to what I think is now virtually the dominant sense of guilt, to judge from what a lot of our interlocutors have said to us over the last 7 years. The closest it gets to it is to say guilt. It notes it in a sort of sub-definition in the whole article. It says guilt is sometimes misused where the writer really means to say sense of guilt. And I think in effect, I did at one point dipped into the Brill translations of Freud, the Strachey, and then some more recent ones. And as far as I could see, the tendency has been for that rather careful, precise usage, sense of guilt, to register the subjective dimension of it. That's tended to fall away of late, because increasingly we think, well, guilt means sense of guilt. It's simply tautologous to say sense of guilt. Guilt is the sense of itself, as it were. And actually, little more than 100 years ago, in formal English usage, as far as I can make out, that just wasn't the case. So there's some very intriguing semantic shift that seems to have taken place.
I mean, there's some, yes, and you're really talking about English, and it's quite interesting to see how it works in other languages. And I think that also came up in the guilt at one point, that in German, the word Schuld means debt as well as guilt. So it's there's somewhere or other somebody says, and I think it may be him, somebody settles their debts to the past. And if the word is the same as the word for guilt, that obviously does yet another thing. Strachey does carefully say sense of guilt every time, I suppose, Freud says Schuld something. I didn't go through every single example, but you can see even in my handout that some of the time when he says sense of guilt, it's not Schuldgefühl, it is Schuldbewusstsein. Of course, that's in a way tendentiously assuming consciousness, where very often in Freud, actually, it shouldn't be. The other thing that intrigued me also about the translation is that why does he translate Vorwurf as self reproach, if it doesn't say self-reproach, if it just says reproach, which it does. But again, I didn't chase that all the way through. But I mean, what I don't know what other linguists might want to contribute about other language things. I mean, it's curious in French, of course, that conscience means both conscious and consciousness and conscience. And that is really tendentious, isn't it? And difficult.
Thanks, Naomi. Perhaps while people reflect on that, I'll just go down to two more questions. The first was from Emily Billman. Emily, you're still in the call. Do you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
Yes, if we take Freud's definition of guilt, as the tension existing between the superego and the ego, I was thinking that by reinforcing the ego, we should be able to regulate guilt, a sense of guilt, because I take those two to be synonymous. I think it's just a nuance that we have to deal with. And then if it is so, if the reinforcement of the ego can diminish the sense of guilt or guilt, how can that affect man's conscience? You see. So I'm coming to the French usage of consciousness and conscience.
Mm.
Yeah, you see?
I do, and I think you're more optimistic than Freud. Although clearly that was his original principle, and I suppose in a way was abiding principle, that you would the whole point about psychoanalysis is to reinforce the ego, the pushing back the sei der See and all that stuff about wo es war, wo soll ich werden. But it was that thing that could never be sufficiently done. And it's quite interesting about when I talked about how does he use the word innocent. He uses it of the ego. He feels terribly sorry for the ego. He keeps saying, poor little ego, trying so hard, embattled from all sides. And we must try and, yes, absolutely what you say, we must try and reinforce and strengthen the ego. But then again, he says the ego is the skin. So it's a bodily ego, but it's the outside bit of the bodily ego, which is, and he even talks about crusts and buns and cooking and cakes at some point. It's the thing that's in direct contact with the outside and the inside, and just endlessly struggling. And then I suppose, I'm not sure whether he would have been, the ways of reinforcing the ego, say in American psychoanalysis, probably wouldn't have carried much weight with Freud, would it? As it didn't with, the ego psychology of that kind. It can easily be misused. But I'm not an actual analyst at all, so I'm maybe being theoretical.
Yeah, but concerning the second part of the question, don't you think that the sense of guilt is related to our consciousness and our conscience? How would we be able to keep and maintain and preserve our conscience without a sense of guilt? Or
No, that's right. I presume we wouldn't. But again, the problem I found with this idea that I said about Merceau and also Freud, that in a way it flattens it out. If you're going to feel guilty anyway, whether you've done anything wrong, if, let's say, you really kill your father, you don't, and you never get any credit for resisting the temptation, that seems very unhelpful, because it's actually not going to allow for people to try and do better than... Sorry, I'm getting an echo. Is everybody getting an echo? Yeah, I think reading all the way through the Freud argument makes it difficult to see how you could actually work with people's choice to do better if they're making that choice. The example, sorry, I'm moving slightly sideways from the question, but the example of masturbation is a very interesting question, because people, children, the little girls in Freud, Gilles, all his life, no, mostly as a child, endlessly struggled against masturbation. Because they might as well not have bothered, because who cares? But at the time, it was felt to be something that was really bad, and which you totally had to stop people doing. And what it shows in the examples he talks about is that their struggle not to do it was a way of trying very hard to be good. I mean, he talks about the little girl, one of the early cases. She succeeded in overcoming it, he says. And that's obviously something he's quite interested in and quite impressed by, or thinks at least is necessary. And because we don't think of it as a particularly criminal act now, it's not easy for us to see how it works as a producer of guilt. But it obviously did work as a producer of guilt. I mean, Gide is an interesting case. I don't know how much you want to know about Gide's body. You probably don't want to know very much. But as a child, he was very religious and endlessly masturbating all the time, even wrote about it a lot. And what he did was to stop himself from feeling that he'd committed the sin. He would stop just before he came. And later on in life, he was a multiply orgasmic, which caused problems as well for him. He actually just wanted to get empty. I've got lots of stuff on this as well. But the problem for him was that he'd been so good at kind of stopping himself that it produced a kind of multiplication of the pleasure instead of a diminution, which in theory was what the guilt was supposed to do. He's an awfully interesting case in relation to that. And yet, if you like, this is an issue that just doesn't exist anymore, you might say. I mean, we do teach children not to kind of fiddle about with themselves in public, but we don't think of it as a sort of particularly terrible thing. Vic, you put your hand up.
Just following on that, what does that mean about Freud's view of masturbation if he kind of thought it was an achievement in the case of these women? And more generally, what it means about the notion of morality, which is also there, came as a question. One of your quotes about the relationship of the psyche to morality, that we can both think of ourselves as worse than we are and think about ourselves as better than we are.
Yes.
And then how that relates also to what James has been saying about the shift of meaning in terms of the difference between sense of guilt and guilt. Now, if the culture has shifted radically, say in relationship to masturbation, it's not considered in that kind of way, that really raises lots of questions about moral transformation or shifts in ethics, shifts socially and culturally in terms of conceptions of guilt, and also very differently about relationships to the body and what you said about real events, because Gide's practice, of stopping, you're then seen as a kind of moral achievement in some kind of way.
Yeah.
You're thinking about, well, what is Freud's notion of the of morality or sexual morality?
Well, I mean, I won't get very far at all in answering it. I think those are such interesting questions. But I mean, where we started with these naughty girls, I mean, the question of childhood naughtiness is quite interesting because Freud was very advanced. He wasn't the only person who was. There were lots of educators about the same time who were very advanced in bringing up children gently and liberally, and even though it may not stop them getting horrible superegos later on, but just being much more considerate of children. But on the other hand, there is clearly at the beginning he's inherited and is working with the idea of actually children being naughty, intrinsically naughty, and sometimes naughty so as to get your attention or something. So these little girls are examples of children who are doing things they know they shouldn't, and they go on doing them. And that idea of the hysteric as traditionally being the worst kind of human being, because you can't trust them, because they're lying and they're drawing, they're what do they call it now, attention seeking. So those kind of accusations of young children, which actually in a way comes from that whole Christian thing of original sin. And, there's nothing Christian about Freud at all. He can see through all those things, and he's terribly good at showing you where original sin has transformed earlier ideas of guilt. Sorry, I'm not being very helpful on that, but because you asked so many interesting questions.
In one of the later quotes, there is the thing about how original sin comes in with Christianity with the child. So you wonder whether Freud or psychoanalysis, I remember kind of writing stuff around Freud in when I was writing on masculinity and unreasonable men, I had a whole thing about Freud, and I was thinking then in terms of, well, what did I feel like about Freud's giving up of the seduction
theory?
What would psychoanalysis be like if Freud didn't, or some of the issues that you're raising in terms of the status of the real event, which complicates this notion of guilt, as if it makes no difference what I actually do, as in contrast to what I think I might do or I'm tempted to do. If there's no difference in that in terms of the relationship of how I feel or the level of guilt, you think, well, there's something deeply questionable in Freud's kind of vision that we might have to kind of rethink, and it might be the giving up of the real event or the giving up of the seduction theory, in 2021 or something. Psychoanalysis might be different. Yeah, whatever we are. Psychoanalysis might look very different. We might analyze it in a different kind of way.
I don't know. There are probably people here who know more about it than me, but in some ways it had to give up the seduction theory, and that the whole idea to locate, that's the advance in intellectuality, the whole idea that you will locate what is important in places that can't be seen. The Oedipus complex matters, whereas a child who's been seduced by, and other analysts of other psychotherapists, theorists have talked about this much more. Ferenczi, for example. But if Freud decided that wasn't important, because if you turned it upside down, you had somewhere much more interesting to go with it, probably would be the answer. We're obsessed enough with seeing every, sort of seeing violent and nefarious wishes behind every bush. That it wouldn't, I don't think it could have been increased any more if Freud had not abandoned the seduction theory. But anyway, it's quite interesting that when he talks about original sin in the latter two texts, the Moses monotheism, whichever the other one was, he's not actually at all interested in the question of it being original in the sense of children are born with it, which is what I think the other side of the naughty little girls turning into the good bad boys actually is looking at. It's implicit in that is the idea that children are naughty. I don't think Freud was doing that at all when he theorizes original sin. And he says Paul did this clever thing. He transformed the sense of guilt into a kind of, there wasn't a murder and eating of the father in some ceremonial event, but there is something much more general. But coming back to Camus, it is very fact that if you read that, I wrote an article a long time ago, which nobody ever published, and it's hanging over me. I would really like somebody to take it up now. But the text is absolutely full. Merceau is obsessed with apologizing. He constantly says, I wanted to say, he asked his boss for a day off to go to his mother's funeral. He said, I wanted to say I was sorry, but I stopped myself because I felt it wasn't appropriate. He does this all the time, and it's always associated with his mother. Then at the moment when he's standing in front of this Arab and the light is glinting off the knife, the metaphors are all from Sodom and Gomorrah, because it's the sky raining down fire, and Oedipus, because I felt as if I had blades in my eyes. So it's totally, these are all, theories of the world in which guilt is a universal fact. And he's clearly obsessed with that, Merceau. And yet people read that entire book and they turn around and think it's all about the person with the clear conscience who refuses, as they always say when they write about French fiction, to say he loves his mother. And that's not what's going on at all in that book. There's a million other things going on. And that idea that if everybody is innocent, then everybody is guilty seems to me to be, that's what's going on in the Freud. Or vice versa. If everybody's guilty, everybody's innocent. Seems what's going on.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm conscious we are overrunning.
We're running.
Perhaps we can go to 12:30 and then draw things to a close if you're happy to do so, Naomi.
I don't mind at all, but other people might. Are there more questions? There's something more.
So there's one more question, and then I know James had a couple of comments at the end. So perhaps we could take that and then draw things to a close. Is that okay with you? Yeah. Mona, you're still here. Do you want to put your question, Naomi? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Naomi, for a really great talk. It left me with a lot of questions. I wanted to ask about guilt by association. So I wanted to know if there was any arguments about people who felt guilty for their ancestors' wrongdoings. We could relate this to people whose ancestors took part in the Holocaust, and they have a sense of wanting to be punished on their behalf to relieve the sense of guilt. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, gosh. I mean, the trouble is this throws up such huge questions. I'll just say a couple of things that occur to me. I mean, Freud, at the point where he's saying, when we grow out of the family context and our sense of guilt is not just a family thing, he then says there is a moment when it becomes a thing on the social scale. And at that point, he says something slightly unclear about it carries the past. The past is then carried within us by the superego. So it'll be in one of those later texts, probably somewhere in my quotations you might find it, or you'll find it by going back to those texts. And it's as if then, and that I think connects to that very difficult question about whether you can inherit acquired characteristics, do you know what I mean? The inheritance of acquired characteristics, I can't remember, what's the name of the person who argued that you could? James unmute.
Lamarck, I think.
Yeah. So that, but in principle, it doesn't make any sense that you can't, just because your French is very good, your children will not be born speaking French. They'll have to sit down and learn it, ditto the piano, etc. If you can inherit acquired characteristics, this seems to be an example of the way you would. And also there's that other idea in psychoanalysis that there are things that you're inheriting in an unspoken way, and that's the theory of the crypt, argued by Abraham and Turek, that the things that your parents say have been through but don't talk about, you inherit this box, and you even if you opened the box, you probably wouldn't find what was inside it, but there's a box and it's got something in it, and that's what you inherit. So you know that there's something from the past that you don't know about. So in some ways, that inheritance, that kind of version of inheritance of guilt is interesting. But I just wanted to say one other thing, which is that there's a book about, it's a book by Simon Wiesenthal called The Sunflower. I don't know if anybody knows, it's terribly interesting about guilt. And it's particularly interesting about forgiveness, the idea of forgiveness. And when he was in Auschwitz, he was in a work detail where they work in a hospital, and he was called in by a nurse who said, I've got a dying SS man who wants you to forgive him. She picked any old Jew, it happened to be him, who he wants you to forgive him. And he doesn't. And then the next time he sees the man's died, and there's a question of meeting the man's mother later on. But he then asked the world to send in their little short essays of 2 or 3 pages to talk about this question. This man asked him to forgive him. What did they think he should have done? And I was discussed in my book group, and it was quite interesting. The Christians who were Christians all said, yes, jolly good, you should forgive. And the Jews, who felt rather closer to the issue, all said, no, you can't forgive that. And you certainly can't forgive on behalf of somebody else, which is what I was sort of meaning to come round to. That you're talking about, if you can't forgive on behalf of somebody else, which I'm sure seems to me to be right, can you declare yourself guilty on behalf of somebody else? That's your question. And I don't actually know what the answer would be, because I can see that there would be a compulsion to do that, but it actually doesn't really make sense. And it would be an example of the difference between being guilty and feeling guilty, a very strong one.
A lot of second generation or third generation young Germans, because I see PhD on this, feel a certain sense of responsibility, though they're not guilty for what their parents or grandparents did. And that has shaped their moral lives in some way. You know, they wanted to contribute or do things or take action. So whether that's guilt by association, it isn't inherited, but it is a sense, so it's not guilt, it's an inner feeling, but it's a kind of historical awareness that you carry this tradition or this these histories.
Yes.
And these are in some way your histories. That becomes, I remember someone who I was working with, and it was a moment of epiphany when she realized that the Holocaust that she'd learnt about in German schools as history was in fact her history. And she went on to write a PhD around that. It's called Alice Hohenlohe, and it's about second and third generation German memory, but just the knowing or not knowing about what your parents or grandparents did, and how that's a moral struggle, not just that you somehow felt guilty for what they did, but you do feel that you exist in relationship to that history and need to find a sense of your own identity in relationship to it. That's a really
Gabriele Schwab is the one who wrote the book. Is she the one you're thinking of? That she wrote a book saying exactly that. And there is quite a lot of work now with children of perpetrators and children or the grandchildren, children of perpetrators and victims. Yeah.
And I've certainly seen an interview with someone who was, I can't remember exactly what his relationship was, but he was, as it were, the son of the camp commandant at one of the death camps. And there's a sequence of him going back to the camp and meeting a group of Jewish school children on their way into the camp to learn about it. And he certainly evinced a sense not merely of moral responsibility, but of a fear lest a certain kind of pollution lurk within his very veins.
Yeah.
And was deeply moved when the children reacted to him by saying, no, that isn't what you carry. You may have a responsibility to do good, but you don't carry that taint.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, the metaphor of pollution is quite an interesting one, because that would be the sort of another version of it, except it's a flow. Yeah.
That was Frank's son.
Philippe Sands talks about this, doesn't he, a lot? Yeah. He's got this thing about the two sons of there were two sons of Nazis, one of whom he made friends with and the other was not. But the interesting thing was that the one who was hated his father and therefore seemed to be the more likable of the two, let's say, the person you could engage with. He hated his father anyway. His father was horrible to him. His father treated him like the interloper in the family. And so in some ways, that's rewinding the whole Freud thing, that actually goes back to a personal family drama, the way these two chaps were brought up. But I went to an event where Philippe Sands was speaking, and so was a woman who was the granddaughter of the great niece, I think, of Himmler, who's a historian. She's married to an Israeli, and she does a lot of these talks. And at the end of it, a woman in the audience said to Philippe Sands, "How could you have been friends with that man?" I can't remember what he was called. He was the son of Otto, somebody or other. "How could you have been his friend?" And people in the audience were jumping up and saying, "But that was the son, that wasn't the man himself." And the woman just said, with tears in her voice, "How could you? How could you?" And left. And the whole audience, this was in the German Historical Institute, the whole audience was very kind of shaken by that sort of unanswerable, we're back to emotion. Yeah.
Thanks, Naomi. Can I bring in James? James, you had a couple of final points that you wanted to make.
Oh, but sorry. The moment for those has possibly come and gone. I did want to ask Naomi to come back to this question about the unconscious and the unwitting, but I see 2:30 has come and gone. So perhaps we can leave that for another time. I mean, perhaps it would be more appropriate for me to end by thanking Naomi very warmly for this extraordinary outline of this material. We've been fortunate to be able to dip into Naomi's accumulating notes in odd interjections over the past few years, but I've never had it all in quite such an impressive and concentrated way before. And it amply bears out the hunch that Sam and I had, that it would be a good idea courageously to shove you on first, because I think, as will become clear in the next session in this little first little sequence of 3 events that we're doing with CCM. What Sam and I have been working on, first, what we're really going to try to do next time is effectively introduce to our new colleagues something of the range of things we've been looking at over the last 7 years. That involves looking at one level just purely empirically at a great range of different types of guilt. And actually to do that, it's almost impossible to do that without drawing on a great deal of Freud's thinking. So it's invaluable from our point of view to have Naomi's presentation of this come first. We will be attempting next month to pull off the neat trick of drawing extensively on Freud without being Freudian, which we'll see whether we manage to succeed in that or not, I suppose. But thank you, Naomi, very much. That was terrific.
I was just going to thank you as well, James, because you got it right, isn't it? I mean, not that I'm not surprised, because you so often do, but I mean, you're from the very beginning, you said, I think this is what happens in Freud, and indeed it does. I mean, a few other things happen as well.
I mean, the hunch worked out.
The hunch worked out. Yeah.
Good.
Following your intuition.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Thank you, James, for bringing us together. I just posted the link to the next event, which is called Towards a Taxonomy of Guilt, Part 1. So if you'd like to come along, then you can register at the link.
Can you just remind me how we can save the chat if we want to? Because I think there are lots of things in it that I can't actually see on. There is a way.
Yeah, I can do it for you and just email it to you, Naomi.
Oh, could you? Okay, that'd be interesting. Because there are things I'm sure I've missed.
Yeah, lovely stuff. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks again, Naomi, for such a rich and thought-provoking paper.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.